Elizabeth to confide in her close friend Montgomery Clift. And on May 12, 1956, Clift joined Taylor at a dinner party she and Wilding hosted at their home in Benedict Canyon. Sometime after midnight, Clift left the party. Moments later, tragedy struck.
Taylor lived on the top of a very high hill. It was a winding, steep road, very dark. Monty's car careened down the hill and smashed right into a tree. Montgomery Clift was literally dying. In the car was crushed. His whole face was mangled, bleeding. Elizabeth Taylor ran down the hill. She got into the car. She climbed into the car. And meanwhile, Monty Clift is just choking. She didn't know why he was choking, on his blood or whatever it was, and she stuck her fingers down his throat and she pulled out his 2 front teeth, and she saved his life.
Elizabeth was devastated by Clift's misfortune. But a few months later, in the summer of 1956, 24-year-old Taylor was in the middle of her own dilemma. When the True Hollywood story continues, Elizabeth Taylor finds comfort in the arms of another man.
Elizabeth fell for Eddie Fisher because there's a deep, deep mourning. He dried a widow's tears, very dangerous occupation.
And later...
And I think almost out of boredom, she took Burton to her bed.
Elizabeth Taylor grew up a child of Hollywood, her every move orchestrated by her doting mother and the powerful studio system. Taylor reportedly began a friendship with cameraman Kevin McClory. The relationship turned into an affair during McClory's work on Around the World in 80 Days. The producer of the film, Mike Todd, admonished McClory for his affair with a married woman, then asked to meet with Elizabeth. The attraction between Todd and Taylor was intense, and Elizabeth dropped McClory and began a relationship with Mike Todd.
Here you had, again, this kind of going back to the strong man. I mean, Mike Todd was, made Nicky Hilton look like an amateur.
Elizabeth began shooting Raintree County in Kentucky in 1956. Although Mike Todd did not produce the film and remained in Los Angeles, the couple carried on a long-distance relationship. When Elizabeth returned to the West Coast, Todd decided he had to have the woman he loved.
She described this event. He grabbed her practically by the scruff of the neck and pushed her onto a couch and said, you're going to marry me. And this was while she was still married to Michael Wilding, and that relationship was deteriorating. And after, some years with Wilding, this guy who was a dynamo, this Mike Todd, who was domineering and pushy, it became very appealing to her.
She needs a Mike Todd, and that's the type of man that appeals to her most, yeah. I think that's why Mike Todd, he put on a campaign to woo her, boy, I'm telling you. I was witness to that. It was unbelievable.
Mike Todd was the professional strongman, the bully. As a matter of fact, she went to see him at the MGM studios where he had an office.
She had a sort of whirlwind affair with Mike Todd, who was everything again that Wilding wasn't. She goes for the reverse every time. Having had the quiet English gentleman, officer and upright fellow, she goes for this extraordinary, fanatical impresario, Mike Todd.
On February 2nd, 1957, just 2 days after her divorce from Michael Wilding, 24-year-old Elizabeth Taylor married third husband Mike Todd in Acapulco, Mexico. Todd was 49. The newlyweds made headlines wherever they went, but the relationship was stormy from the very beginning.
Again, he was the other side of her nature. He was vulgar, he was brash, he was rich, he was funny. He brought out all the kind of showman in Liz. And together they were like Barnum and Bailey. They were a circus act. They used to fight in public. They would fight on street corners. They would have physical punch-ups on Broadway. And we all said, God, they're a funny pair, because they were always brawling.
The public battles of Taylor and Todd paled in comparison to their turbulent private lives. Todd's good friends, actress Debbie Reynolds, and her husband, singer Eddie Fisher, became part of the bizarre drama.
Mike and Elizabeth would go over to dinner at Eddie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds' house in Hollywood. And as Eddie described the scene, Todd suddenly slapped Elizabeth Taylor off of her seat, took her by the hair and dragged her across the living room floor into the bedroom. And Elizabeth could be heard screaming and whining, and Debbie Reynolds ran into the bedroom, and Todd was on top of Taylor, seemingly pummeling her. And Debbie Reynolds, thinking that Elizabeth was being massacred, jumped on his back to try to wrest him off of Elizabeth. And Todd turned around and said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "You're killing Elizabeth." And Elizabeth says, "Listen, if I want your help, I'll call you for it." You know, she loved it. I mean, this was sort of a prelude. And the next thing Eddie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds knew, the door to the bedroom slammed shut, and they could hear the sound of lovemaking.
The intensity of the Taylor-Todd relationship seemed only to deepen the love they shared for one another.
She was happy with Todd. She gave as good as she got. They were like two prize fighters living together.
1957 was a jubilant year for the volatile couple. To Mike Todd's surprise, Around the World in 80 Days won the Oscar for Best Picture. But Elizabeth, not one to be upstaged, had a surprise of her own.
We're going to have a baby. I think that's exciting, too.
That's an understatement. Can you imagine? I don't know. I hope I live through all this.
On August 6, 1957, 25-year-old Taylor gave birth to a baby girl, Liza Todd. 2 months later, in October of 1957, Taylor, Todd, and baby Liza embarked on an extended European press junket to promote the international release of Around the World in 80 Days. When the family returned to the United States, Taylor began work on Cat on a Hot Tin Roof with Paul Newman. While Elizabeth struggled with a bad cold, delaying production, Mike Todd arranged for the couple to fly to New York City, where Todd was scheduled to receive an award from the Friars Club. Doctors ordered Elizabeth to stay home, and because of threatening weather, she pleaded with Todd not to make the trip. But Todd insisted, and on March 21, 1958, his plane called the Liz took off from Burbank Airport. It was the last time Elizabeth Taylor saw her husband alive.
I'm sure Mike conned those pilots into taking that plane up. No self-respecting pilot would have taken that plane up in that kind of weather. The next morning at 7 o'clock, my phone rings and I answer. It's an AP Chief of Bureau in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He says, "There's a plane down here at Grants, New Mexico, and it's crashed and everybody's dead." So I had to call up Dick Hanley, who was Mike's secretary, and Dr. Rex Kennemar, who was Elizabeth's doctor, and the three of us converged on their home. She started running and screaming through the house, and Dr. Kennemar grabbed her and shot her with a hypodermic and knocked her out.
On March 25, 1958, 50-year-old Mike Todd was buried in Forest Park, Illinois, near Chicago. Todd's close friend, singer Eddie Fisher, accompanied Elizabeth to the funeral, and the two consoled each other in the difficult days that followed.
Mike Todd and Eddie Fisher were like this. They were like very close. Eddie Fisher admired Mike Todd. And as a matter of fact, that's what eventually brought Eddie Fisher and Elizabeth Taylor together. They were both bereaving when Todd died.
On March 28th, just 3 days after the funeral, the 1958 Academy Awards ceremony was held in Los Angeles. Nominated as Best Actress for her role in Raintree County, Elizabeth watched the event on television, too grief-stricken to attend.
She had sedation and was drinking scotch, I believe, and tears, murder for her. She was just absolutely devastated.
Elizabeth did not win the Oscar that year, and for the next 3 weeks, still grieving for Mike Todd, Elizabeth struggled with little or no sleep, while Eddie Fisher maintained a near round-the-clock vigil.
Eddie Fisher performed the most dangerous duty known to man. He dried a widow's tears. Of course, he was very solicitous of Elizabeth and her grief.
Prodded by the studio, Elizabeth returned to the set of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, but the loss of Mike Todd had a profound effect on her performance.
Maggie, the cat is alive! I'm alive!
She continued making the film after a very brief period of mourning. And apparently that only helped to deepen the performance, that the off-screen tragedy didn't interfere with the role.
Film critics responded with glowing praise for Taylor's steamy performance as Maggie the Cat, the sexually repressed wife of Brick Pollitt, played by Paul Newman.
I feel all the time like a cat on a hot tin roof.
Jump off the roof, Maggie, jump off.
Soon after Cat on a Hot Tin Roof was released in September 1958, Taylor made headlines once again. Elizabeth was involved with another man, another married man, her old friend and confidant, 30-year-old Eddie Fisher.
Eddie at the time was married to Debbie Reynolds. Here was a case of the all-American boy singer being married to the all-American girl, and you had Elizabeth Taylor, the femme fatale.
Taylor and Fisher carried on a very public affair that became the scandal of the 50s. Hollywood's influential gossip columnists had a field day, and newspapers around the world labeled Elizabeth a homewrecker for breaking apart one of America's favorite couples. Debbie Reynolds was humiliated and furious. She threw Fisher out of the house and filed for divorce. The press and the public turned on Elizabeth, calling her the Black Widow.
She had broken up with Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher in the late 50s, and she received a lot of adverse publicity for that, which really worked against her.
But not for long. Cat on a Hot Tin Roof was the top-grossing film of 1958. Hotter than ever, Taylor nabbed her second Oscar nomination and became the most sought-after actress in Hollywood.
There was a period in the 50s when she was playing a series of Tennessee Williams heroines in which she did have great parts, and she rose to the occasion, but the studios gave her those parts. She never fought for those parts.
On May 12, 1959, the divorce between Fisher and Debbie Reynolds became final, and just 2 hours later in Las Vegas, Nevada, Eddie Fisher became Elizabeth Taylor's fourth husband. Taylor was 27, Fisher 31. Following the brief ceremony, the elated bride told reporters, "I've never been happier in my life. We will be on our honeymoon for 30 or 40 years." But the 30-year honeymoon Elizabeth predicted with Fisher didn't last nearly that long.
Liz never really got over the air crash that killed Mike Todd. On the rebound, she married his best friend, Eddie Fisher, to try and keep Mike Todd alive in her mind. That was a disastrous affair.
Despite her chaotic personal life, Elizabeth Taylor's love affair with the camera could not be denied.
There is something that comes through the camera that is almost unlike any other performer, in a kind of perfection of beauty. And because of that great beauty, people might say, well, she's so beautiful, she doesn't have to be anything else.
Her affair is entirely with the lens. She doesn't relate to other actors. She doesn't relate to directors or writers. She relates to that lens. She knows the camera loves her, and she loves the camera. And they have this extraordinarily sexy, unspoken alliance. The true love of Liz's life is the camera, and the camera is, in a way, her best lover.
In 1959, Elizabeth earned her third Academy Award nomination for her role in Suddenly Last Summer. She lost the Best Actress award to Simone Signoret, but Elizabeth was now a bona fide screen goddess. Meanwhile, Eddie Fisher's singing career stalled. Fisher was relegated to being little more than an escort for his famous wife, following Elizabeth to the set, catering to her when she was ill, and tending to her 3 children. In August 1959, Taylor and Fisher traveled to Paris with hopes of mending their troubled relationship. Back in Hollywood, producers were casting for an epic motion picture, and Taylor was at the top of their list. On September 1st, 1959, Taylor's agent called her in Paris with the offer to star in Cleopatra. Elizabeth was indifferent about the movie and the role, but what followed would change Hollywood forever.
She didn't want to make the film, and as a joke, she said to her agent, well, ask $1 million. They won't give it, and then I don't have to make the movie. They asked for $1 million. The studio came up with $1 million, and at the time, that was an unprecedented sum for a performer. It was the beginning of the system in which big stars are free to negotiate huge salaries on a per-picture basis.
Taylor's contract to star in Cleopatra